Hi there. There's been a lot of discussion over the last few days since the horrible and tragic terrorist events in Paris and Beirut, Lebanon, about the refugee crisis that continues to plague both the Eastern European, Western European nations, as well as our own country here in the United States. There's been a lot of really divisive and xenophobic, at times Islamaphobic rhetoric that's been used by politicians, by pundits, by others that have called for a moratorium on welcoming refugees into the United States as well as in other countries. This is something in France as well, that there are political groups that have really spoken up really vitriolically against immigration and migrants, as well as refugees who are fleeing war-torn places like Syria and Iraq. Today, Pope Francis reminds the Church that Jesus Christ himself had an experience of being a refugee, somebody along with his parents who as a small child had to flee into Egypt from the fear of and the persistent threat of violence and persecution. His own life was at jeopardy. And this is something Pope Francis calls the whole Church to remember when we see those who are in need, those who are fleeing terrorism and violence in places like Syria and Iraq, that we have an obligation, a Christian moral call and duty to care for those who are fleeing these war-torn places around our world. Here in the United States, this is also something that affects us and affects those in a very particular way to our south, our neighbors in Central America, who also are fleeing, in many instances, gang violence, drug war violence, and the like. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Pope Francis, what he's reminding us of, comes to us from the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, the infancy narratives. But there are bookends to Matthew's Gospel that help us, I think, to recall what our duty is as Christian women and men in light of this refugee crisis, in light of the violence that people are fleeing and the need that we have to care for them. The fleeing to Egypt, to the desert, as a refugee takes place at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, but at the end we have in Matthew chapter 25 the famous second coming of Christ, the famous judgment scene, in which we are held accountable for our lives based on how we cared for those least among us. Jesus repeats time and time again to those who lived according to the gospel, the so-called sheep, and those who didn't, the so-called goats, that it was when one cared for the least among us that we cared for Christ. And so in this way, we must recall that our action, our care for our neighbors, especially the poor, especially the migrant, but in a most acute way, in the most present circumstances, those who are fleeing places of violence, the refugees of war, we must care for them. Now, there are a lot of people who have expressed incredulity or skepticism about one's own safety or the safety of this country and the like. And on the one hand, there is a logic and an understandable sort of reaction that's associated with that, and I get it. I want to say that first and foremost, and I think people like Pope Francis and others do as well. But in light of that, there are two things that we must keep in mind. And this has to do with what it means to be a Christian and not what it means to be somebody who operates, as St. Paul puts it, according to the logic of the world. So that first point I'd like to make is a recollection, is an encouragement for us to return back to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, in which he makes a clear distinction at the outset that there's a difference between the wisdom of the world, how politics, how international relations, how commerce, how capitalism, how philosophical systems, how cultures operate and think and see what's valuable, important, and logical, and how God sees the world and what the wisdom of God is. And to those who live in the world, the wisdom of God appears foolish, nonsensical, a stumbling block, and yet this is what we are called to do. We preach Christ crucified, St. Paul says, and likewise we preach that we desire to follow in the footprints of Jesus Christ. We bear the name Christ as Christians, and what that means is acting foolish in the face of what seems logical. And what seems logical is to hold up our walls and our borders and to keep all those who are in need out, but that is not what Christian life and Christian living is all about. We must care for one another, especially our neighbors most in need. And on that note, though there is a understandable natural reaction, one of fear, one of uncertainty, one of doubt, we should keep in mind the fact that Jesus nearly every time he appears to his disciples after the resurrection, says, and oftentimes the first words out of his mouth are, "Be not afraid." That fear is not only the root of war, as Thomas Merton says, but fear is also the enemy of Christian discipleship because it prevents us from following the gospel, from caring for our neighbor, and instead tempts us and leads us to embrace a worldly wisdom or logic which is exclusionary, which is biased, which is discriminatory, which is self-centered, and which places our own interest and concerns and sense of security above the desperate needs of our sisters and brothers around the world. And so, in light of what the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops have collectively said and what Pope Francis continues to remind us about and what the gospel makes very apparent, I'm adding my own voice as I continue to reflect and share with you my own thoughts about what's unfolding. I want to encourage you to share with one another a reminder of what it means to live the gospel, as frightening as it may be. May we be consoled by Jesus' words to not be afraid, and to remember that this is how we will be judged by our Maker, to care for the least among us, including and especially refugees.